For a long time, there has been this fight for the big conferences to exclude the smaller conferences at the top level of college football, right? And in the college football playoff era, it really didn't matter what you did in the Mountain West. It really didn't matter what you did in the WAC. It really didn't matter what you did in any of the non-Power 5 conferences because you couldn't get into first the BCS championship game or then the college football playoff, which was 4 teams. It was hard enough to get a second Pac-12 team or even one Pac-12 team or one big, because the SEC has been so dominant trying to convince people that there's a world outside of the SEC. So when they put all this together and we now have our college football playoff, to many people it was, hey, we got to remember the little guy. There's got to be a spot for one of the other non-Power 4 conference schools. We have gone from excluding the non-Power 4 conference schools to completely bending over backwards to the point of being ridiculous. Now, what you're going to hear from me runs in many ways mentally counter to what you think I believe in college basketball. It's not. I am a consistent human being, and when I evolve and change what I think, that becomes consistent as well. I'll go back. I was a champion of Wichita State. They went from an 8-9 game all the way to the Final Four. The next year, they were undefeated in the regular season. And I believe they shouldn't have been a number 1 seed. And the logic behind it was, well, the reason they're undefeated was the league was down. The teams they played weren't particularly good. And most every team on that schedule, most every team who was in that top 8, 10, if that was the schedule they played, they'd probably go undefeated too. It's not a punishment. It's like, hey, well, let's be honest. Are they one of the 4 best teams in the country? The answer is no. Are they having a great season? Are they capable of beating those teams? Sure. And it's a hard measuring stick, and they end up getting beat by a Kentucky team that had earned their 8-9 seed. And again, part of the deal with Kentucky was this goes counter to the same argument. The Wichita State fans at the time were mad at me because I was like, look, quality of their schedule deceives you as to how good they actually are. They're like, no. We earned this 1 seed. Well, okay, then why were you mad that you played Kentucky that year as an 8-9 seed? We're like, well, they're way more talented than their actual record. Okay, well, they earned that 8-9 seed. Do you understand? Do you guys, am I explaining the contradiction well enough? I think I am.
You are.
Okay. So here's the issue with college football. I'm not saying Boise State isn't having a great year. They are. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be included. They should. But I'm looking at the current college football rankings, okay? And I've done this before with big schools. Washington, for example, once upon a time got a 1 seed in college basketball, and I asked this exact same question. If they are legitimately one of the 4 best teams in the country and deserve to be one of the top 4 seeds, are any of you picking them to win the national championship? And the answer would be no. Why? Because you don't actually think they're one of the 4 best teams. You don't. So why would you put them as the 4 best teams? Inclusion, great. Include them as an 11 or 12 seed. The same thing goes for Indiana, who I don't think should be in the field. It's not their fault they didn't play anybody, but they didn't play anybody. And the one time they played somebody, they could not throw the ball. They're just not that level. They're not Ohio State. They're not Texas A&M. Like, ask yourself honestly, isn't there a reason? Like, every SEC school is spending 2x of what they spent at Indiana on their roster. Now, do you miss on guys? Sure. But football is a game of attrition. Would any of you pick Indiana to win a national championship? And the answer is no. Nobody's going to pick them. Whereas A&M, Ohio State, LSU, Tennessee, those teams, and I'm not an SEC wonk, but there's a reason that every year in the NFL draft, on about a 3-to-1 ratio, SEC players get taken. Why? And now we knew they were doing it before. Now it's totally legal. They're just buying the best players. And now they're getting smart and they're buying really good coaches. And then the other part to it is that what evened out the field for the Pac-12 last year was the Pac-12 schools had spent a bunch of NIL money, and they had gotten transfer quarterbacks who were in their 4th or 5th year, and it evened the playing field against superior overall rosters. Indiana doesn't have that. Boise doesn't have that. And my point is that I understand it's human nature to go from, hey, these guys have never been included. Look, we've all seen it. Those of us who lived long enough. Right? Do you remember when Hawaii played, I think, in the Sugar Bowl? Do you remember when Cincinnati played, I think, in the Sugar Bowl? Do you remember when, who else was it? Like, pick any of these teams. And when they've played elite competition in the elite bowl games, it's ended very poorly, and you sit there and go like, what am I actually watching? This game was over in layup lines. And, oh, yeah, by the way, we're not talking about can they pull off an upset. Can they win 3 or 4 games? The NCAA tournament and the college football playoff are one and the same. Okay? And I love that the NCAA tournament rewards teams that win their conference tournament championship. Do I believe that's always the best way to find the best teams? I don't. But there is a reward. The reward is inclusion in the tournament. But what they don't do is include you and then inflate your status to a bye status or to a top seed simply because your record's good. And that's what we're doing with Boise, and that's what we're doing with Indiana, and they are not at the level of the rest of the teams. And the Indiana thing is perfect because I've said this in college basketball. Just because you're in the Big Ten does not mean you have a good record, you're playing Big Ten teams. Take a look. Who have they played? Who have they beaten? All of the middle to bottom of the teams in the Big Ten. They played one of the top 4 teams in the Big Ten, top 5 teams in the Big Ten, and they lost, and they weren't particularly competitive. I saw people like Dennis Dodd tweet out at halftime, 14-7, that's a playoff team. Like, halftime scores? Great. Go check out our halftime score against Oklahoma State. We're down 1. Against Providence, we're down 1. Is that the way the game ended? No. Why? Because they're better than us. So we've gotten to this place in college football, which is very similar to what we do as human beings. We feel so bad about slighting people that we massively overreact. And instead of just saying, hey, look, non-power 4, we give you a spot. Now we're like, non-power 4, we'll give you a spot. Ooh, what if we put you on the bye line? Wait, we're going to give them a bye? Why? What possible logical reason would you give them a bye? Because they almost beat Oregon once and they played no one else of substance? Like, that's a real. Here's all you need to know about Boise State and what the world thinks of them. If they lose to UNLV in the Mountain West championship game, they won't be in the field. So wait, we're going to go from a 4 seed, lose one game to being out of the field? Whereas any of those other teams, top 4, top 5, lose another game, they're still in the field. Why? Because we all know that SMU's not any good in comparison. You're like, oh, SMU's in the ACC. Okay. They played BYU at home, who has a chance to compete for the Big 12 title. They lost. They actually played a decent schedule at Nevada, won by 5. Game they came from behind. They beat TCU, one of the bottom feeders or middle to bottom of the Big 12. And outside of that, in their own league, okay, take a look at who the best teams in the ACC are. Just look at them. Look at who the best teams in the ACC. No one thinks the ACC is particularly good. And they beat Louisville. Great. Okay. They didn't play Clemson. They didn't play Miami. They didn't play Syracuse. They didn't play Duke. They didn't play Virginia Tech. They beat Stanford, Florida State, Wake Forest, NC State. You kind of go look through the teams they played. Ugh. And if you think SMU is really good, that's great. Let's see what happens in the ACC championship game. Because when they lose that game, they will not be in the field. And right now we're doing we felt so bad about what's happened to teams previously that we're going to include them just to include them. When the reality is, just take the 5 or 6 best SEC teams. They're better. Then take the rest of the conference champions. Then figure out what 1 or 2 other Big Ten teams. Okay, you're going to have 2 or 3 from the Big Ten. Ohio State and Oregon should absolutely go. Maybe a Penn State. We'll see. Okay, maybe one more from the ACC or the Big 12. Maybe not. And then you take a non-Power 5 and then, let's go. Let's go play football. But this is what we do. When you're called a sexist, you then almost appear to be a feminist to friends. People who are called a racist, they always go, no, these are my black friends. And they fall down at the feet of woke culture. If you're somebody who people say you spend too much money, now you become completely thrifty on everything you do. Or if you're ever called cheap, you go above and beyond and you tip 25%, even though there's no reason you should tip 25%. Or you take people out to some opulent dinner that no one actually needs to afford. This is human nature. We massively overreact to our own flaws and misgivings, times we misspeak, etc., etc. Everyone knows it. But we don't need to do that when we're deciding a college football championship. Just because the non-Power 4s haven't been included in the past doesn't mean we need to go from admitting them to granting them VIP status.